Hi, this is Misha, and this is part 2 in our series on the Enfield. This video is going to look at the most famous Enfield, the short magazine Lee Enfield, or SMLE, or as it's sometimes abbreviated, SHTLE, or sometimes just called the SMLE. In my hands is an SMLE Mark 1 ****, and we'll get into what all that means in a minute. Now, from part 1 we looked at really the failure of the Lee Metford and Lee Enfield during the Boer War. Keep in mind we have a short 18 and some change inch, 19-inch barrel rifle, carbine, and then a 30 and some change inch rifle. After that, the concept of the short rifle was starting to come into vogue. And really, Britain was one of the first major militaries to go for it. That's where the short comes from in magazine Lee Enfield. Rather than having a rifle for infantry and a carbine for cavalry and artillery units and other crews, we have a one-size-fits-all concept with a 25-inch barrel. Now, when this was first suggested in Britain, it caused outrage. Infantry proponents, the generals and all that, thought it won't have the range and the accuracy needed. Whereas high-ranking officers in the cavalry said, hey, this won't be light enough and short enough to suit our needs. There was a lot of arguing back and forth, not dissimilar to the whole detachable box magazine. In the end, though, it was decided that the economic advantages of a 25-inch barrel having one size fits all were just too great, and they went with it. What they quickly discovered was going from a 30-inch to a 25-inch really didn't impact accuracy or range noticeably at all. And they also discovered that going from an 18, 19-inch carbine to a 25-inch short rifle really didn't add much weight and length to the cavalry, and it solved the range problem they were having in the Boer War. So it gave them more range and accuracy, and it gave the infantry something a little handier, and the costs were very minor. They would first prototype what would become the SMLE in 1901. As I said, right after the Boer War, they were already interested. And by 1902, the original patterns were essentially out of production, except for the very final New Zealand carbines. These would be patterned and type classified in 1902, and they would start to see service and production in 1904. The one I'm holding here was actually made in 1904, so it's a pretty early example. And this is the original SMLE Mark 1. So from the original Metford and Lee Enfield, we're getting away from that style of pattern 1888 bayonet, and we're going to a new pattern here. The ring actually mounts on this nose cap lug as opposed to on the barrel. And the lug's back here with the stacking swivel. Have a full length upper handguard, front, back. We have a protected front sight with kind of these concave ears. The rear sight has been substantially altered from the original. We are now adjustable this way. And we have a windage adjustment knob here. Now that said, this is not the original rear sight for this gun, which I'll mention why in just a minute.
Sorry, thanks for the feedback. That
is Alexa's contribution to this. Apparently it likes guns. Now looking at the action, we still use the same bolt action from James Paris Lee. I didn't mention in part 1, I apologize, the way this works, just to kind of quickly look at it, it's a little easier to do on this type anyway, is we have rear locking lugs here, and we have a rotating or movable bolt head here. And while we're playing with it, we'll notice we have this contraption here on it. This was the first attempt to allow it to be topped off by stripper clips, or what the British would call chargers. It slides with the bolt. and it matches a cutout on the side of the receiver here for the other side of the guide charger. Now we've done away with the dust cover over the bolt on this model because of the needing to be topped off with chargers. We've gone to a different style of cocking piece. We still have half cock. Well, come on. There we go. There's half cock. Got that off easy this time for you. We have now moved the safety to the receiver here. Thumb safety. It's interesting because this is kind of similar to the original type of safety used on the Lee Metford, the Mark I. We still have volley sights here and here. Obviously they have been recalibrated for the shorter barrel. We still stow our cleaning kit in the buttstock, pull through an oiler. We still use a Lee pattern detachable mag. We're finally not chaining these to the gun anymore. At the same time, we're only issuing one with most guns because now that we can top off with chargers, if this one wants to be ornery here. Let me see what it doesn't. Come on. It's old. Give it a break. There we go. Trigger is very much the same. And that is the short magazine Lee Enfield Mark I. As I said, these would start to be fielded in 1904. And in 1906, they would update some of the older Lee Metfords and Lee Enfield long rifles to this pattern, along with the charger guide. They would call these, if they just added the charger, CLLEs, and if they upgraded them to the SMLE standard, they would become the SMLE Mark II. And this program would continue for quite a long time, out past around 1911, 1912, converting older guns. Other older guns would be converted into .22 training rifles, as it were, for both the Army and the Navy. Then, however, in 1907, the SMLE Mark III would be introduced. And this is obviously the true quintessential short magazine Lee Enfield. We've made a few important changes. We've gone to a new style of front sight protector, as long as a new shape to the front sight. We have strengthened this handguard and forearm, making it a little bigger. Rear sight is pretty well the same. Actually, it's exactly the same. We'll get into why in just a minute. The action now has a new charger guide. Gone is the rather finicky system of the Mark I. Now we have a bridge across the receiver for a charger to sit in. This is fixed, much better design, and it takes a lot of garb off the bolt. We've also gone to a slightly updated pattern of mag that is supposed to be fully interchangeable between guns. With the original Mark I's, mags sort of kind of had to be fitted a bit and wouldn't always work with various guns. Now they're considered interchangeable. It's worth noting that both of these still have the magazine feed cutoff. This one is extremely stiff on this gun. I think it's the mag. I think this mag is a little bit bent. There we go. The old guns. Half cock is still there. Safety's still there. And this was the version that just really took off, the Mark III. We strengthened it up. A little faster and easier to mass produce, more reliable clip system. These would go into production at Enfield and BSA in 1907. They would soon follow at the Ishapur factory, as well as LSA. And finally, in 1913, the Lithgow factory would join in the fun. So we're being produced in several factories within the UK, and also being produced in Australia and India. In 1910, Britain introduces its first Spitzer projectile cartridge. Mark 7, I believe. I may be wrong about a mark or so on there. I apologize if so. And that's why this rifle here has the same rear sight as the one I was holding. Older SMLEs and other guns that had the sights calibrated for the round nose projectiles that were in use, like the Mark 6, were given new rear sights for the new cartridge. That's where this star comes from, because this was upgraded several times to try to keep it relatively up to date and modern. Now, the Enfield wasn't without controversy even into the 1910s. So I thought I'd just bring this rifle out briefly, talk about it for a minute. Hold open follower. This is the P14, our pattern 1914. This is a British issue gun in .303 with a 26-inch barrel, and this is based on the Mauser. Some people were just not convinced that the Lee Enfield was up to snuff, even after it had been in service for a number of years. They still had a bad taste in their mouth after the Boer War. So a program was begun to replace it. Originally, they were going to go to a Mauser action based on the 1893, and they were going to be firing a new small diameter high velocity rimless cartridge replacing the old rimmed .303. This was known as the pattern 1913. It had some developmental issues mostly related to the cartridge, but the action was very stable, very well done. But World War I got in the way. Now we have a full video on this gun, so I don't want to really go into it here. This video is on the true Enfields, but this was designed in Britain as a kind of a copy. It has some Enfield elements, such as the safety over here. There we go. And it has this rear peep sight. Kind of keep this sight in mind. It'll come back very soon. We have a peep mounted on the rear of the receiver bridge. It flips up and is easily adjustable. These still have volley sights, by the way, which is kind of interesting. So we have a cock on close Mauser type bolt with the lugs in the front, as opposed to the Enfield cock on close bolt with the lugs in the rear. And an Enfield style rib trigger and kind of semi-pistol grip stock. This is heavier than the Enfield. Since Britain did not have the capacity to produce these during World War I in country, it contracted out with Winchester and Remington to make them for them in the USA. However, by the time Winchester, Remington, and Remington opened a secondary plant at Eddystone, by the time the three plants were ready to go and started to ship rifles in 1916, the good old Lee Enfield SMLE had proven itself to the British, and while they took delivery of the pattern 14, they really didn't have much use for it. After 2 years of hard combat with the Lee Enfield, their confidence was restored in it. But it's an interesting footnote. This also relates to the US 1917 Enfield. And again, we have a video on both if you're interested. They're very interesting and well done guns. I really like them. But it is worth noting that they had such lack of confidence in the SMLE that they had a gun ready to go to completely replace it, and if World War I had not happened, very well might have. The SMLE Mark III was the gun that Britain went to war with in World War I in 1914. And as with everyone else during that war, they needed to turn out as many as possible. 1915, they began to introduce simplifications. The gun I'm holding here was made by BSA in 1915, and it has some of the earliest simplifications known. Really, the very first thing they got rid of were those volley sights. It was quickly apparent that they were of little to no use in the trenches of World War I, so they're gone. We still have the windage adjustable rear sight here, and we still have this darn magazine feed cutoff. BSA would really be the first factory to introduce changes. In 1916, LSA and Enfield would follow suit. And in 1918, one of the last would be the Lithgow factory in Australia, which this is here. This is a full so-called Mark III Star, which was officially adopted in late 1915 and allowed British factories to introduce simplifications to speed up production during the war and to use fewer resources. As said, we finally got away from the volley sights. We would go to a simplified rear sight, which is now no longer windage adjustable, it's just elevation adjustable. We would simplify the front nose cone by deleting the stacking rod here, or swivel I should say, on this gun. We would replace the swivel point in front of the magazine with a simple loop, and this loop is now just used to tie a cover over the action. We would go to a cocking piece that is a simple serrated slab. Not only do I think this is faster to produce, I think it's actually a better device. I mean, it's just easier to grab. And we would finally get away from the magazine feed cutoff as well. Now, these changes were introduced at different times at different factories. A gun like this from 1918 would have pretty much all of them. One of the last ones to be introduced was the slab cocking piece. The mag feed cutoff and the windage sight would go earlier. But quality of manufacture never really decreased. These were still well-made guns. And they actually would keep them open to accept that mag cutoff. And the idea was to fit them with it after the war. They really liked that for some reason. They hung on to the feature longer than most other nations. There was also something that began in 1916 called the pedal scheme, which started with SSA. And not to get into its history too much, but it was an interesting idea to try to farm out small parts manufacture to different subcontractors and private firms and then assemble all the parts at a major factory. It didn't work. There were parts delays, the quality wasn't up to snuff, but they did try it. They were trying what they could to speed up production. During the war, most people know about this gun's performance. The bolt system is quite smooth. Trigger is acceptable. 10-round magazine. We can now be topped off with chargers. We're long enough for range, but not so long we get in the way of ourselves. We have a fully protected barrel, which is good. You're not going to burn your hand on a hot barrel. We have protected front and rear sights, so they're not going to get knocked and bent so easily. They were relatively economical to produce, especially by the standards of World War I. It was a really good gun. It served Britain well. If it hadn't, they would have pursued the P-14 more so. Now that said, the whole idea of troops thinking they were going up against machine gun fire when they were just facing several guys with Enfields, those have been long debunked. That was just a propaganda article done by the British in World War I. But that said, they were quite fast rifles to use and reload, and the biggest drawback was the 303 cartridge itself. We have a rimmed round. It has adequate range, power, accuracy, but nothing special. And we're still using this rear locking lug system on the bolt with the rotating bolt head, originally designed for a black powder gun. It is still adequate, but it is nowhere near as strong as, say, something from a Mauser, or, for that matter, the P14. The action is strong enough to do what it needs to do, but it's not overbuilt like many others of that era. The wood furniture, too, they intentionally designed these where they could use multiple pieces of wood and not always the highest grade of wood. And if you look inside, there's a lot of cutouts and things to accommodate different bits of the receiver. So sometimes when you unstock an Enfield, it's broken inside. So the furniture wasn't the strongest ever made either. Notice how the buttstock is a completely separate piece. It's fastened with a long screw into this receiver socket, so they could use different pieces of wood throughout. But then again, by the early 20th century, Britain had been experiencing pretty severe deforestation thanks to a long career of shipbuilding. So they wanted to be able to use whatever wood they had on hand. So sometimes the stocks on these aren't the strongest. No one really knows how many of these were produced during the war, because we have several factories and many were kept in service long after, but they were produced in the millions. Production would continue for the SMLE Mark III in England until 1940, although in very small numbers in the 20s and 30s, just because they didn't really need that many. And it would be kept at Lithgow until at least 1953, and perhaps even 1963, I've read some sources claim. I think that might be when it was declared obsolete, though. I think 1953 is about the latest I've seen. India, the Ishapur factory, would continue building the Mark III after it was independent from England. It would make further simplifications, and even introduce a 308 version known as the 2A, and then an updated version of that known as the 2A1. And really no one knows how many were made over in Ishapur, or even when production ended. It seems clear that they were definitely making them throughout the 60s and into the 70s, and perhaps even into the 80s. The Indians were issuing them to police. They even had a single-shot 410 shotgun version used by riot control police. This gun has a very long service history. It has seen action throughout the world, in many wars. Next to the Machinegun, it's about the most long-lived military bolt action, and it was produced in the largest numbers. This really is the quintessential British military rifle right here. And it definitely tops the Martini Henry and what came after. But I've always thought the Enfield, especially the SMLE version with this fully stocked forearm and flush muzzle, was just a very cool look, and they're fun to shoot as well. I have nothing against cock on close. Some people do. I think they work just fine. I think cock on open works just fine too. Well, this was part 2 looking at this version. If you liked the video, please click like. If you haven't already subscribed, we really appreciate it if you would do so. And please tune in again next time for part 3 with more on the British Lee Enfield. This is Misha. I'll catch you then.